had always believed that pain was something you felt in your body, like the sharp sting of a blade cutting flesh, the dull ache of a broken bone, or the throbbing torment of a fever. But the night I lay dying in that sterile white hospital bed, I learned that the deepest pain doesn't live in the body at all. It lives in the heart, in the soul, in the very marrow of your being when the people you trusted most proved they were never really on your side. The fluorescent lights above me hummed softly, flickering every now and then, casting cold shadows on the walls as the machines around me beeped in steady rhythm, their sound both comforting and terrifying. The smell of antiseptic burned my nose, and the rough sheets scratched against my fever-soaked skin, making me feel like I was lying on sandpaper. My chest rose and fell with difficulty, each breath a battle, as if invisible hands were squeezing the life out of my lungs. But none of that compared to the sound of my mother's voice, calm and deliberate, spoken with the kind of coldness only hatred could carve into a person's tone, as she told the nurse standing beside me, "Don't waste medicine on her." For a second, I thought maybe I had imagined it, that maybe the fever and exhaustion were playing tricks on my mind. I wanted to believe that even if she had always disliked me, always treated me as less, there was still some shred of humanity in her that wouldn't allow her to condemn her own daughter to death with such cruel indifference. But then she repeated herself, sharper, cutting through the silence of the room like glass shattering. "Don't waste it. She's been a burden her whole life. If this is the way she goes, then let her go. I have other children worth saving." The nurse stiffened, her gloved hand hovering uncertainly above the tray of syringes and vials she had prepared. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the silent war she was fighting between her duty to save a life and her obligation to respect the wishes of the family. My eyes, wide and filled with tears, darted from the nurse to my mother, silently pleading, begging for mercy, for compassion, for something, anything that resembled love. But my mother's gaze was like stone, unyielding, as though she were staring at a stranger, not the daughter who had once clung to her dress as a child, seeking warmth and comfort. My siblings had always been her pride, her jewels, her trophies she displayed to the world. My brother Daniel, the successful lawyer, my sister Rachel, the golden girl with her beauty and charm, even the youngest, Peter, the spoiled son who could do no wrong. They were the children she loved, protected and celebrated. And then there was me, the mistake, the unwanted one, the child who was never supposed to be born, the constant reminder of choices she regretted. I had been told all my life in one way or another that I was a burden, that I was less than, that I was the shadow at the edge of their shining light. But still, deep down, I had always held on to the desperate hope that if things were bad enough, if my life truly hung by a thread, my mother would at least soften, at least show the faintest flicker of maternal instinct. I was wrong. Her words didn't just wound me. They gutted me, stripping away any last illusion I had of belonging, of being loved, of being worth something to her. The tears rolled down my cheeks, hot and bitter, not from the illness ravaging my body, but from the cruelty in her voice. I could feel despair wrapping itself around me like chains, pressing down on my chest heavier than the sickness itself. My lips trembled, my throat burned as I tried to speak, to cry out, to say anything at all. But only a weak, rasping whisper came out. So faint, it was drowned beneath the beeping of the monitor beside me. The nurse, bless her heart, leaned closer, her eyes filled with conflict. "Ma'am," she said softly, almost pleading. "Her condition can stabilize with treatment. The medication will help. I said don't waste it." My mother snapped, her tone rising sharp as a whip crack. "Do you hear me? Don't waste medicine on her. I won't pay for it. Let her go. She's nothing but a burden. My other children matter. She does not." The nurse flinched at the venom in my mother's voice. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand to know why she hated me so much, why my existence offended her so deeply that she would rather see me die than allow a vial of medicine to touch my veins. My mind flashed back to childhood, to the countless times she had reminded me of my place. I remembered the time when I was 7 and came home crying because the other kids at school had bullied me, only for her to sneer, "Well, maybe if you weren't so useless, they wouldn't pick on you." I remembered when I turned 12 and asked her why she never hugged me the way she hugged my siblings. And she said, because I don't feel anything when I look at you. I remembered birthdays that were forgotten, punishments that were harsher for me than for anyone else, and the way she would smile at my siblings with pride but look at me with irritation, as though I were a stain she couldn't wash out. And now, here she was, sealing the final chapter of her cruelty by trying to deny me the very thing that could save my life. My vision blurred, not just from the sickness, but from the tears clouding my eyes. And I thought, maybe this was it. Maybe this was how my story ended. Not with love, not with family gathered around to say goodbye, but with rejection, abandonment, and the cold voice of a mother who had never wanted me. The world around me began to fade, the edges of the room dissolving into darkness, the sounds of the machines growing distant. My body trembled, my breathing shallower with each passing second. Yet, amid the suffocating despair, a small flame flickered within me. Rage. Pure, unfiltered rage. A rage that cut through the weakness, through the helplessness, through the despair that threatened to swallow me whole. I realized then that if I survived this, if somehow fate or defiance or sheer stubbornness gave me one more chance at life, I would never again waste it trying to win her love. I would never again beg for scraps of affection from people who saw me as nothing but a burden. No, if I lived, I would rise. Not for her. Not for them. But for me, I would rise to destroy the false pedestal she stood on, to shatter the illusion she had built around her golden children, to expose the lies she told herself about who was worthy and who was not. I would take her scorn, her hatred, her cruelty, and I would turn it into fuel, into power, into the very fire that would consume her pride. The nurse's voice trembled as she argued faintly with my mother. Her words blurred in my fading consciousness, but I clung to that small defiance like a lifeline. Maybe, just maybe, not everyone agreed with my mother's judgment. Maybe the world still held people who believed my life was worth saving. My chest heaved as I struggled for breath. The hiss of the oxygen mask faint in my ears. The darkness pulled at me, whispering for me to let go, to surrender, to slip quietly into nothingness. But even as the shadows pressed closer, I clenched my weak fists, nails digging into my palms. No, I wasn't done. Not yet. If death wanted me, it would have to fight harder. And if life gave me one more chance, I would come back stronger, sharper, fiercer. I would make her regret every word she spoke tonight. I would make her regret ever calling me a waste. When I opened my eyes again, it wasn't to the warmth of family gathered around me, holding my hands and whispering prayers, but to the faint glow of the night lamp and the quiet determination of the young nurse who had defied my mother's command. Her face hovered above mine, eyes weary yet resolute, and she whispered with a voice that trembled, but carried steel in it. "You're going to make it, don't give up, not for her, not for anyone but yourself." And it was in that moment I realized that my survival had not been granted by love or maternal instinct, but by the bravery of a stranger who saw value in me when my own blood did not. And that truth settled inside me like a seed of fire, small at first, but destined to grow into something unquenchable. The days that followed were filled with pain, with nights where fever consumed me and mornings where every breath felt like a knife slicing through my chest. But slowly, through the persistence of the nurse and the stubbornness buried deep inside me, my body began to heal, though my heart hardened into something unfamiliar, something sharp and unbreakable. For I understood now that I had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. I would never again waste my life begging for love from people who had already written my death sentence. I would never again measure my worth by their cruel eyes, and instead I would rise, not to earn their approval, but to one day make them choke on the poison they poured into me. The first time my mother came back after that night, she didn't bring flowers, didn't bring comfort. She didn't even bring my siblings. She came alone, her heels clicking on the sterile hospital floor as if she were arriving at a business meeting. Her arms crossed over her chest, lips curled in disdain. And when her eyes fell upon me sitting up in bed, pale but alive, she sneered, "You're still alive," as if the very fact of my survival was a personal inconvenience. And before I could even respond, she turned on her heel, her perfume lingering like poison in the air, and left. And in that single moment, something inside me snapped, something that had been stretched too thin for too long. It was the last tie of hope I had clung to. The last desperate belief that maybe, one day, she would change. That maybe there was a piece of her that loved me. But it was gone now. severed clean, and in its place came a silence so powerful it roared inside me. From then on, I decided that survival was no longer enough. Survival was only the beginning. I had been left to die, abandoned like trash, but fate had pulled me back, and that meant something. It meant I had been spared for a purpose, and that purpose was to make them face the consequences of what they had done. So when the doctors finally discharged me and I stepped out of that hospital into the world again, I did so as someone reborn, someone whose scars were not just wounds but weapons, and I vowed that I would never return to that house. Never again sit at the table where my siblings sneered and my mother belittled me. Never again give them the power to crush me. Instead, I disappeared, vanished like a ghost from their lives. And in my silence, I sharpened myself. The years that followed were grueling, filled with loneliness and labor, but each day was a step away from weakness and closer to the empire I envisioned. I took the jobs no one else wanted. I scrubbed floors. I washed dishes. I lifted boxes until my muscles screamed, and all the while I saved every penny, swallowing the hunger in my stomach and the ache in my bones, because I knew I was building something bigger, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. And as I worked, I studied, devouring books on finance, on law, on business, teaching myself the skills no one had bothered to give me, molding my mind into something sharp enough to carve a future out of the stone walls my family had trapped me behind. People underestimated me, just as my mother had, and I let them. I let them laugh when I wore the same shoes for years. I let them dismiss me when I walked into banks with small savings. I let them sneer when I bought broken-down properties that no one wanted, because I knew that patience was a weapon. And with time, those properties became homes. Those small savings became investments. Those dismissals became opportunities to strike unseen. And slowly, quietly, my fortune grew, my power expanded, and the woman who had once been discarded in a hospital bed was now a shadow with influence in places my family didn't even know existed. I never answered their calls, never replied to their messages, never showed up at holidays. I let them think I was gone, forgotten, erased, because silence was my cloak and my shield, and in the emptiness they believed I had vanished into. I thrived, surrounding myself with allies who knew my worth, with people who looked at me not as a burden but as a force. And when I was finally ready, when the wealth and the strength I had built were enough to stand unshakable, I began to watch them again from the shadows, like a predator circling its prey. I learned that Daniel, the golden lawyer, had drowned himself in debt, gambling away the fortune he had inherited, clinging to a facade of success while his world crumbled beneath him. Rachel, the beautiful charmer, had fallen into scandal, her vanity leading her to affairs that ruined her reputation, her once dazzling smile now little more than a mask for desperation. Peter, the youngest and most spoiled, had grown reckless, his arrogance leading him into dangerous circles, owing money to men who did not forgive, his safety dangling by a thread. And at the center of them all was my mother, once regal and untouchable, now aged and bitter, clinging desperately to the throne she had built on cruelty, blind to the ruin she had raised, still strutting in her pride while the empire she boasted of collapsed around her. They had laughed when I was weak. They had turned their backs when I was dying. They had treated me as less than nothing. But I was no longer that girl gasping for breath on a hospital bed. I was no longer the shadow cowering in their presence. I had become the storm they had created, the storm they could not escape. And as I watched them sink deeper into the chaos of their own making, I felt no pity, no regret, only a calm, cold satisfaction, because I knew the time was coming when I would step out of the shadows and reveal myself, not as the forgotten child they once discarded, but as the woman who would bring them to their knees. And in that moment I whispered to myself, I was never the waste you were. The day I returned to my family's doorstep was the day their carefully constructed world shattered, though they didn't know it yet. I arrived not as the sickly, unwanted girl who had once gasped for breath on a hospital bed while her own mother condemned her to death, but as a woman forged in fire and silence, a woman who had taken every wound, every insult, every rejection and turned it into a weapon sharper than steel. And as my heels clicked against the cracked marble floor of my mother's crumbling estate, I felt the weight of years pressing behind me, years of betrayal and loneliness now coiling into one moment of reckoning. And when I pushed open the heavy oak doors, their startled faces greeted me, my siblings with hollow eyes dulled by failure, My mother with disbelief frozen across her face as if she had seen a ghost, which in a way she had, for I was supposed to be gone, erased, buried by the grave she dug with her words. She staggered slightly, gripping the armrest of her worn chair, her voice a hoarse whisper that trembled with equal parts fear and fury. "You're supposed to be gone. You should have died that night." And her words, instead of cutting me, only fueled the cold fire in my chest, and I replied with a voice steady as stone. "But I didn't. And every breath I've taken since then has been leading to this moment." And with deliberate care, I laid out the leather folder I carried, opening it like a judge presenting evidence, each paper a nail in the coffin of their pride, the deeds, the foreclosures, the bank slips, the contracts, proof that while they had laughed at me, dismissed me, erased me, I had been quietly building, acquiring, owning, until every path they walked, every roof over their heads, every asset they thought belonged to them was tied to me. Daniel was the first to crumble, his face draining of color as he recognized the foreclosure notice of his house with my signature stamped at the bottom. The debts he had drowned himself in now tethered to me as his creditor. Rachel's hands shook when she saw the contract stripping her of the last boutique she had desperately clung to, a property I had bought through a shell company years ago, waiting for her vanity to bleed her dry. Peter, arrogant as ever, cursed and shouted, threatening me, his voice cracking with panic when I revealed that I held the notes to the men he owed money to, that I was the one who had purchased his safety, meaning his life now rested entirely in my palm. And then my mother, once regal and untouchable, sat rigid, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests, her eyes darting over the documents that stripped her kingdom bare, and for the first time in my life I saw something other than contempt in her gaze. I saw fear, raw and unguarded, and it was sweeter than any affection she could have ever offered. My siblings begged, cried, cursed, each one unraveling in desperation, but I remained unmoved, my face carved from the same stone she had once used to beat me down. And when the noise reached its peak, I silenced them with words as sharp as knives. "You called me a waste," I said, staring directly into my mother's eyes, those eyes that had once looked at me like I was nothing. "But tell me, who wasted their chances? Who squandered everything handed to them on silver platters while the one you abandoned built an empire from nothing?" My mother's lips twisted, trying to form words, but they came out brittle, trembling with rage. "You ungrateful!" But I cut her off with a hand raised sharply, my voice rising above hers like a gavel slamming down. "No, you were ungrateful. You had a daughter who would have loved you, who would have given you everything, who would have stood by you until your last breath, and you threw her away. You tried to kill her with your words. You buried her before her time. And now I return the favor, not with death but with life. A life where every breath I take will remind you of your failure, where every day you wake will be a punishment, because you will see me, the daughter you discarded, standing above you, holding everything you once claimed, proving that I was never the waste. You were." And as the silence fell heavy in the room, broken only by the sobs of my siblings and the shallow, rapid breaths of my mother, I closed the folder with finality, as if sealing their fate, and turned to leave, their cries echoing behind me like the hollow wails of ghosts chained to their own ruin. Outside, the air was cool and sharp, filling my lungs fully, freely, and for the first time in my life I breathed without fear. Not because someone had given me oxygen, but because I had taken back the air they once tried to steal, and I realized that my revenge was not just in their downfall, not just in the wealth or the power I had claimed, but in my survival, in the fact that against all odds, against the mother who had cursed me and the siblings who had mocked me, I had risen, I had endured, and I had triumphed. And that triumph was the ultimate vengeance. For I was not a waste of medicine. I was the cure to their poisoned legacy, the living proof that what they tried to destroy had become indestructible. And as I walked away from the ruins of the family that had once tried to bury me, I knew with unshakable certainty that I was finally free.